I was deeply moved by my visit today to the Western Wall. Words fail to capture the experience. It will leave an impression on me forever. Today we reaffirm the unbreakable bond of friendship between Israel and the United States. A friendship built on our shared love of freedom, our shared belief in human dignity, and our shared hope for an Israel at lasting peace. We want Israel to have peace.
You're probably the best-known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation. And it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup. You
know, Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly, because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down into the building. So it was getting the speed from going downhill, so to speak. It just seemed to me that to do that kind of destruction is even more than a big plane, because you're talking about taking out steel, the heaviest caliber steel that was used on a building. I mean, these buildings were rock solid. And, you know, it's just an amazing thing. This country is different today, and it's going to be different than it ever was for many years.
What was already a decision made by Truman. So Truman decided to vote for or to accept and to recognize the establishment of the State of Israel. It was about 15 minutes after the Israeli proclamation was made. And under these circumstances, the Israelis wished to achieve from the United States what they thought was one of the most essential issues that would secure the existence of the State of Israel. Now, the Israeli flirt with the United States had started at about 1949, but the origins of the Israeli inclination to see the United States as the state supporting the Zionist cause had started after 1939. In 1939, the British government decided to back off from the Balfour Declaration and from the League of Nations mandate that called for the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. In 1939, the British withdrew from that decision. And it was shortly afterwards that David Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Jewish agency, that was the de facto Jewish government, and he decided to move to the United States and to start to run the Zionist politics from the United States. In 1942, for example, it was in New York, in Biltmore Hotel, that it was the first time that the Zionists announced publicly their goal, which will be the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. That was the first time that such a statement was made. And it was done in New York, and it was not incident. Now, when David Ben-Gurion, moving to New York during the Second World War, indicated that David Ben-Gurion thought that from now on the Zionist movement should concentrate and should act in the United States to gain United States support for the Zionist idea. Because the assumption was that just as happened after the First World War, it will be after the Second World War that a new Versailles conference will be convened, new decisions will be made, and during that new conference, the United States will support, that was the hope, the establishment of a Jewish state.
Today, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality.
America's commitment to the security of Israel is ironclad, and I might add, so is mine.
Like all Americans, I have been inspired by Israel's long struggle to survive and to flourish. America, as always, is proud to stand with you.
And you have built a mighty democracy that will endure forever and can always count on the United States of America to be at your side.
And as the president of a country that you can count on as your greatest friend, I believe your future is bound to ours.
The respect and the admiration we have for the people of this nation, their courage, their tenacity, is one that makes us proud to stand with Israel as we have in the past.
It was 70 years ago that the United States under President Truman recognized the State of Israel. I stand in awe of the accomplishments of the Jewish people. And I make this promise to you, my administration will always stand with Israel.
Israel is grateful for the support of America's people and of America's presidents. We share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands that cherish freedom and offer hope.
I think that all of your drills for dealing with terrorism and disaster are going according to plan, or has this been of such of magnitude that we've just all been caught totally off balance?
Oh, there's no question we were all caught totally off balance. No one could possibly expect large airplanes to crash into the World Trade Center the way this happened. I think.
Well, I was getting this question in the 1990s, and I said that the West really doesn't understand militant Islam. So I wrote a book in 1995, and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islam is bringing down the World Trade Center. I was getting this question in the 1990s, and I said the West really doesn't understand militant Islam. So I wrote a book in 1995, and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islam is bringing down the World Trade Center.
I saw people jumping out of the World Trade Center. I saw some of the firefighters who I know going into the building. And we were in a building in which we were trapped for about 10-15 minutes.
Are you talking about did you go immediately to the Office of Emergency Management?
No, I went down to the scene, and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10-15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out, walked north, and took a lot of people with us.
Reportedly, by the year 2000, the Port Authority was looking at an asbestos abatement bill of as much as $1 billion, the same money it would have cost to build a brand new tower. Back in the 90s, the Port Authority had sued the insurance companies, trying to get them to cover the cost of the asbestos removal. But in May 2001, 4 months before the terrorist attack, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey lost their 10-year-old court battle. At that point, the Port Authority was between a rock and a hard place. The Twin Towers could no longer be maintained without incurring the cost of asbestos removal, yet they could not be demolished because of the large amounts of asbestos they contained. The only remaining option was to dismantle and remove the two poison-filled giants one piece at a time. But the cost of such an operation would have been so astronomical that no one has ever tried to put a number on it. Luckily for all, the stalemate was broken when a real estate tycoon named Larry Silverstein, who already owned Building 7, offered to purchase a 99-year lease for the Twin Towers.
76 years old, and look at him go. He walks fast, talks fast, and is always selling.
Silverstein seemed in a big hurry to close the deal. Even though he had been hospitalized for a car accident during the bidding operations, he asked his doctors to take him off the morphine so the deal could be finalized.
So I told the doctor, I said, kill the morphine, and I got to get my people in here, because you can't think with morphine. So they let the morphine run down. The pain was terrible, but I brought everybody together, and that's when we framed our best and final bid.
On July 24, 2001, Larry Silverstein celebrated the acquisition of the Twin Towers with a public ceremony.
Silverstein signed the lease on the World Trade Center just 6 weeks before 9/11.
He then took out an insurance policy covering the Twin Towers for $3.2 billion in case of total destruction. Silverstein then began spending every morning of the week in his new office in the North Tower.
And so my mornings were spent at the Trade Center, and then by noon I was back uptown.
But on September 11, luckily for him, Silverstein didn't go to work. Even though he had already scheduled a business meeting in the North Tower, he found out that his wife had made an appointment for him at the dermatologist.
The morning of September 11th, Silverstein was scheduled to have breakfast at the restaurant at the top of the North Tower. He canceled at the last minute at the insistence of his wife, Clara, who wanted him to go see his dermatologist.
That particular morning, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go.
Everyone who was in that restaurant that morning perished.
And then, just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance.
This is how, on the evening of September 11, Larry Silverstein found himself in control of some 12 million square feet of new office space to be built on some of the most valuable real estate in the world. And since the terrorist attacks had been two separate events, contended Silverstein, the insurance companies would have to pay him $7 billion to rebuild what he has always been calling My Three Towers.
I will spend $7 billion on My Three Towers.
Eventually, a settlement was reached for $4.5 billion, which was still 1/3 more than the amount initially insured by Silverstein. And since on September 11, due to the terrorist attacks, Building 7 had also been destroyed, Silverstein received another $800 million to rebuild a skyscraper that had originally cost $400 million.
It's a much more beautiful building. It's a glass facade, allows the light to come into the space. The views on four sides are phenomenal, and the space looks magnificent.
In the meantime, all the asbestos from the Twin Towers has been inhaled by the citizens of downtown Manhattan, and especially by the first responders and volunteers who worked at Ground Zero, who are now being decimated by mesothelioma and other pulmonary diseases.
Anyone for their race, so you hate them for their nation state. And that is why anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism.
But this gets to the heart.
This is a dark day for truth and justice. The ICC prosecutor has apparently decided not to dismiss outright the Palestinian claim against the State of Israel. This is a baseless and outrageous decision. The court has no jurisdiction in this case. The ICC only has jurisdiction over petitions submitted by sovereign states, but there has never been a Palestinian state. The ICC prosecutor's decision has turned the International Criminal Court into a political tool to delegitimize the state of Israel. The prosecutor has completely ignored the legal arguments we presented to her. She has also completely ignored history and truth when she says that the very act of Jews living in their ancestral homeland, the land of the Bible, that this is a war crime. We will not be silent. We will not bow our heads before this outrage. We'll continue to speak out against this travesty of justice.
So I see this visit as an opportunity to reaffirm the unbreakable bond between our nations, to restate America's unwavering commitment to Israel's security, and to speak directly to the people of Israel and to your neighbors.
It's an honor to be here with the first Jewish president of the United States.
Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.
Larry Silverstein is a terrific owner in New York and a very good friend of mine who I just called. I was very worried about him because I assumed maybe he was in the building. He took possession of the building 1 week ago. As you know, he just bought the World Trade Center.
Right.
And he was in his office, and he was getting ready to move into the World Trade Center over the next 2 weeks. So when I just spoke to him...
Where were you on September 11th?
I was home.
More than 90,000 Orthodox Jews fill MetLife Stadium on this New Year's Day. A sea of rabbis, scholars, and Jewish families celebrating what they consider to be a huge accomplishment, the completion of the Talmud.
A compilation of rabbinic literature from hundreds and hundreds of years ago that is studied by Jews all around the world.
This is the 13th Siyum HaShas, a celebration to mark the completion of the Talmud. 2,711 pages. It's a process that takes 7.5 years, and Jews from all different levels of observance participate, studying one page each day.
Rabbi Meir Shapiro founded the concept in 1923. He had this wonderful idea, wouldn't it be something to unify all Jews to where they all study the same page every single day?
This unity event also comes with amped up security, as this celebration comes on the heels of a string of anti-Semitic acts in the New York area in just the past few weeks. On Monday, a man named Grafton Thomas was charged with federal hate crimes. He's accused of stabbing 5 people at a Hanukkah celebration last weekend in Monsey, New York. That's where Rivki Feiner lives with her family.
Just to be in an event like this, to see people come from around the country, certainly from Monsey and from Rockland, and all the horrible attacks that are happening in Brooklyn and the city, but at the same time we have to be resilient.
So many members of the Jewish community here refuse to let fear define them. As for the Talmud, now that it's been completed, it's time to start right back at the beginning, page 1 on Sunday, and another celebration in about 7.5 years. At MetLife Stadium, I'm Dana Arshan, Fox 5 News.
Rabbi Hirsch, I think it was published in the JTA, and there's a line there that is amazing. He said, "Those who are not concerned with Jewish survival will not survive as Jews." There's some... I read an article by Rabbi Hirsch, I think it was published in the JTA, and there's a line there that is amazing. He said, "Those who are not concerned with Jewish survival will not survive as Jews." There's some...
The region in which the Jews had lived, and actually going all the way back to the very first exile in the year 586, there were Jews who were settling in Babylonia, and in particular in this region here, if we zoom in, you can see the 2 blue lines that extend from the upper left down into the Gulf there. Those are the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates, and in that region called Mesopotamia, because it is between the rivers, Meso means between and Potamos means river, there are a lot of Jewish settlements. They ended up growing and becoming very significant, and ultimately, especially after the decline of the land of Israel under the Romans, they become the centers of Talmudic learning. And so basically the Talmud is developing in both Israel and in Babylon, and as I mentioned earlier, that's where ultimately we have 2 distinct texts recorded. Okay, so that was kind of a quick, maybe verbose overview of where the Talmud was formed and the historical context in which the Talmud was formed, I want to take 1 minute to talk about what the Talmud is certainly not. Now, because you know, a lot of people are going to see this video, not necessarily people who are committed to the study of the Talmud for its own sake. I've shut off all comments because there are a lot of people who have this crazy idea that the Talmud is some kind of like secret document that is the, you know, the whole rules for the secret world Jewish conspiracy, which does not exist, by the way, and that somehow it's this nefarious document. A lot of this anti-Semitic thought springs from the twisted mind of an individual named Johann Andreas Eisenmenger, who in the late 1600s portrayed himself as a potential convert to Judaism in order to study the Talmud primarily. And he spent 19 years doing this. And he was actually quite a brilliant scholar. He went through the entire Talmud, he went through all kinds of midrashim, things like that, and then in the year 1700, he came out with this nasty 2,000-page book, which took every single passage he could possibly twist and take out of context and present it as a horrible condemnation of Judaism and Jews and so on. Now, this is not, he was not the first person to do this, a rather bizarre, obsessive kind of individual. We have people doing this for a few centuries prior, but, you know, in reality, that's not what the Talmud is all about. If you don't believe me, there are lots of places where you can see Talmud the way Jews see the Talmud. I do not recommend you go to anti-Semitic websites because they will essentially just repeat Eisenmenger over and over again. You know, go see how Jews deal with the Talmud, and you will be assured that it's basically just this, well, it's not basically anything. It is a fascinating discussion of how Jews encounter the universe and try to get closer to God.
What being a Jew means comes from the written word, you know. So if you're completely ignorant of that, you know, bagels aren't going to make you Jewish.
But do you think that knowing about the Orthodox aspects of Judaism and like why they do certain things and why they're wearing stupid hats, like, do you think that's important to know?
I do. I wish I had known that. I wish I had exposed. You know, to me, an educated decision or choice comes from knowing everything, and then you can make a choice.
Everything they do seems insanely time-consuming. Like, it just takes over your entire life.
The religion needs that element of the religion. The religion cannot continue with the people, because we can't continue with people like us, because you assimilate, you marry, now you have kids, you stop, this one doesn't get bar mitzvah.
Instead of going and praying for an hour every day, if they went and worked at like a soup kitchen, they'd actually be helping people. Whereas just going and reading a book for an hour and mumbling to themselves, who are they helping?
Yeah, and then in 200 years, there's no more Jews.
How's it going? Brandon. Shmuley, nice to meet you.
What are we doing today?
Heard you came to study some Talmud?
Sure, whatever that is.
You up for that?
Yeah, come on, let's do it.
I'll let you know. Can I offer you a kippah, a hat? What do you prefer?
A hat would actually be kind of funny.
Nice. You look good.
Do I? Okay.
Just like that.
I usually can't pull off hats, but this one looks good.
Perfect.
Okay.
Picture perfect.
All right, nice.
The way Torah was given to us was actually, we got the written law, the Bible, and an oral tradition.
Yeah.
And that tradition is not necessarily boxed in. It's actually rules to interpret the written law. And there's many different rules and many different ways of interpreting every single passage.
Wait, you kind of lost me. Wait, so
okay.
The oral tradition you're talking about, I learned about this, where when Moses was in the desert, he was just kind of speaking and telling people stuff, and then eventually
that's a small part of it.
Okay.
Eventually they wrote it down, but what he actually taught them was rules of how to interpret. We call this the Masorah, the tradition. It's rules of how to interpret the text. The text on its own is very unclear.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to really properly understand. It's the beauty of it, but one big part of it is that it's actually open to the interpretation of the rabbis at any given time to use the tools, and one rabbi will say, hang on, I think that it means this, and another one will say, hang on, I think it means that.
So who decides who's right?
That's who decides who's right. That's exactly what we plan to study today.
This is just kind of a weird way to structure a page. It's like... And then in the middle?
Well, that's the laws, and those are the interpretations from other rabbis more than 1,000 years later.
Got it.
The first word on your page is Mishnah. And in the second paragraph, you have the word Gemara, right?
Yeah.
On this page, that's the Mishnah, and that's the Gemara. That itself is about a difference of a couple of 100 years, 300 years. This was the first time that the oral tradition was ever written down. But it's all like, what did my teacher say and what did his teacher say? And that keeps the link. So I know that I'm studying what my teacher taught me and his teacher taught him and his teacher taught him all the way back to Moses.
So we're reading analysis from people from hundreds of years ago?
And more.
People were so stupid back then, I feel like. They didn't even know how to, like, drive a car.
They didn't have cars.
Exactly.
So we're going to start the Mishnah. Do you want to read the English? Do you want me to read it? You want to read it?
If one had 2 slaves, one large and one small, and similarly, if one had 2 fields, one large and one small, and the buyer says, I purchased the large slave or field, while the other one says, I don't know which one I sold. The buyer...
Now, how could that be? How could it be he doesn't know which one he sold?
Yeah, you're not just like, go ahead, take any field. You know which one you sold.
So I asked you first. I wanted you to ask me, and then I'd be the chat. Now I'm asking you, try and work it out.
Oh.
How could it be? How could a seller not know what he sold?
I would say you're an idiot. Case closed.
Okay.
You got to know which one you sold.
You're not coming with enough belief in the system. If you believe the system, there is a very good case over here. So what the interpretation, I think probably a footnote, is there a footnote over there explaining it? That's really cheating, that's like the cheating with the footnotes, but I'll have the interpretations on the side. Okay. And what they basically explain is that it means we never stipulated it. That means I'm not sure. The buyer says, you told me that you're selling me that iPhone 4. And the seller says, we never spoke about it. I had a 3 and a 4 in my store, and I wasn't, I never told you which one I'm selling you for that price.
Isn't there a part of you that's like, all right, I'm taking advice from people who thought owning slaves was
fair? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're arguing over who gets the slave. How about just like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have slaves?
If today someone's going to have a slave, I'm going to look down from them and say, what are you doing?
Right.
But if in a time when it's socially accepted to have slaves, then there's something wrong with it, but nowhere near as bad as today, when we know what we know. So if you accept that in that time that was a normal thing to have and to be buying and selling normal commodities, then why not?
Okay.
I trust him,
Fair enough.
This book of Mishnah and Gemara, there's about 22 volumes, and each one with a different amount of pages, right? Like this one has 100 and something pages. So if you did a page a day, which a lot of people do, a lot of people study 1 page every single day, that's just like the routine, and it'll take 7 years.
A more direct attack on Christianity came from Oxford University Press in England in 1908 when it published a false and intentionally misleading Bible called the Scofield Reference Bible. Its mission was to inject into the Christian text reinterpretations that made the future state of Israel the way to God.
This book was so important that Oxford University Press opened its first branch in the United States to publish it. They had never published an American book before. They had not published Whittier's books, his poetry. They had not published Longfellow. They had not published any of our great American authors, but they published this.
The Oxford University Press published the Scofield book. They promoted it into key American seminaries and Bible schools where the beliefs of future generations of pastors could be molded to cloud the peacemaking traditions of Christianity and benefit the state of Israel. Most pastors and teachers were unaware of any danger, since there was no state of Israel at the time. Most of them did not even know the Jewish state was being planned. Few guessed that the Scofield book would be used by secular powers to bend Christians into political and financial servitude to the Jewish state, present-day Israel. American Christianity became increasingly Zionized after 1948, when the State of Israel appeared as a result of the United Nations edict. Oxford University Press was strongly Zionist-influenced, and it provided a huge financial and promotional boost when it opened a publishing branch in New York City. This for the purpose of publishing the Christian Zionist Manual in 1908, called the Scofield Reference Bible. This book was to be a foundational document upon which Christian Zionism, by a host of other names including evangelicalism, would begin its methodical growth by deception. The founders of World Zionism, especially Chaim Weizmann, successor to Theodor Herzl, had much to do with drawing the United States into World War I. A mere handful of dominant American Zionists were able to influence President Wilson, possibly by blackmail, to join the war in Europe over his advisors' objections. America lost over 100,000 men who were entirely innocent of any involvement in European politics, and out of all this, the World Zionist movement gained a piece of land called Palestine. The land of the Philistine was England's payoff to World Zionism for causing America to enter World War I on the side of Great Britain, which was losing the war to Germany. By 1917, the World Zionist movement was in high gear toward occupying Arab Palestine after the Balfour Declaration gave them a claim, without title, to any land occupied by the Palestinians. The Scofield Reference Bible was copyrighted in 1909. It is an Old and New Testament with most of the notes in the original text added in the Old Testament. Later, many notes were added to the New Testament as the Scofield Reference Bible was re-edited several times, with the most radical change being made in 1967.
The book has been updated over and over again, each time by Oxford University Press, always having Mr. Scofield's name on the front of it. In fact, he's listed as the editor in the most recent edition, even though he's been dead for about 40 years.
The cover shows the editor, Cyrus I. Scofield, with 7 other men on the editorial board. One of these was Reverend James M. Gray, president of the Moody Bible Institute, one of the most influential organizations in evangelical circles of the day. There were also 2 other seminary leaders on the editorial board. Those lending their names were predominantly heads of seminaries and Christian colleges.
What happened is the distribution took place through these seminaries. And then when young pastors were graduated from these schools and they went back out and took a church and started to teach from the pulpit, they had one of these in their hands. This is what was given to them. And I suppose that they were probably given to the seminaries. It was likely that the Oxford Press was very generous in making sure that all these people had these.
What exactly is the Scofield Reference Bible? Let us look critically at just one page of the book that has become the guide for secularist Jews in Israel and evangelical Christians in America to explain why they think present-day Israel has the right to all of the land in the Middle East, beginning with Palestine. Genesis 12:3 is part of the Torah and is quoted in the Quran. These 3 verses are standard in the King James translation and very similar in other Bibles. Let me paraphrase it as you read the Old English. The Lord told Abram to leave his home and family and go into a land that God would show him. God promised to then make of Abram a great nation, bless him, and make his name great, protect him by blessing his friends and cursing his enemies. And from Abram's seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Now for the part that is important to traditional Christians. I quote, "In these shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Christianity has for 2,000 years taken this to be the first notice from God of the coming Savior of mankind. Genesis 12:3 is the earliest covenant that God made to Abram, and it is the one used by Israelis and Christian Zionists to justify the idea that the entire Middle East should be Israeli property. I quote, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee." Zionists of all races interpret the phrase, "into a land that I will show thee," as a perpetual land grant to present-day Israel. Now we will examine the most effective corrupter of Scripture in history, one Cyrus I. Scofield, a 19th century American. Note on page 19 that the footnotes dwarf the text. Note also that the italicized insertions in between the verses that are not part of the Bible. In the 1967 version of the Scofield Reference Bible, there are more footnotes than in the original 1909 version, and since the death of Scofield in 1921, the footnotes have grown to dwarf the text in these very important pages. Let's look again at the vital footnote 2 found in the Scofield Reference Bible in 1967 on page 19. The footnote reads, "God made an unconditional promise of blessing through Abram's seed to the nation of Israel to inherit a specific territory forever." But the passage doesn't say anything like this. God orders Abram to go to a land that God will show him, using the first-person familiar thee, meaning Abram and no one but Abram. The passage does not say that God is giving any piece of land to anybody forever. It doesn't say anything about Israel.
Now, how complicated is it? Leave your land, go where I tell you to go, and I will protect you. How complicated is that? How many footnotes does it take to understand what God was saying to Abraham? I mean, anybody who reads that should be able to figure that out, that's what the message is. But Mr. Scofield wrote all of this to explain it.
In fact, if we accept biblical history, we know that Abram had no children when this happened, and not for quite a while. So there was no person or nation named Israel when this promise was made. There was no state or nation named Israel. The man Israel did not even exist in Abram's imagination when God spoke to him. How then could Scofield or the Oxford University Press say that God was promising the land to the present-day state of Israel forever?
Where did the state of Israel get in this? When Abraham was spoken to by God, Israel, the man known as Israel, hadn't been born yet. He was 2 generations in the future. And he was not a state. He was a person that eventually had a tribe. And then after him, 3,000 years later, along comes a bunch of Europeans who name their state after him. But this says that God gave that land to the nation of Israel forever. Imagine 70 million people who are taught this every day.
The Oxford University Press did not stop there. Note 3 on page 19 reads, "There is a promise of blessing upon the individuals and nations who bless Abram's descendants, and a curse lay upon those who persecute the Jew." The word Jew is used in the footnotes in describing an occurrence 2,000 to 3,000 years before the word Jew existed. In fact, Jew is taken from the name Judah, who was, it is told, one of the 12 grandsons of Abraham, Abram of Genesis 12. Neither Judah nor Jew existed, and this footnote is a false concoction. Note 3 continues, God's promised Abram and his seed certainly did not terminate at Sinai with the giving of the law. The New Testament and Old Testament are full of post-Sinai promises concerning Israel and the land which is to be Israel's everlasting possession. Listeners should be asking, why is Oxford University Press putting words in the mouths of the readers of this Bible? To make them think their God promises blessings and curses on people today based on how they think about or act toward present-day Jews and present-day Israel. What about all the other people in the world?
Let's read further. Unlike America, Israel seems to be able to fight wars very quickly. What is your secret? Because we don't seem to have the hang of that.
The secret is that we have America.
רואים אור בקצה המנהרה? אני בוודאי רואה אור בקצה המנהרה. אני לא מאמין שהמלחמה עם ערבים תימשך לנצח. אני חושב שהערבים בסופו של דבר הם בני אדם. הם בני אדם, הם לא יתיקו את הראש בקיר לנצח. אבל אם הם רואים בקיעים בקיר, אם הם רואים שחלק מהקיר נהרס, אז ודאי שימשיכו, ויסייעו להם כל העולם. לכן מה שדרוש כרגע זה לעמוד מול הדבר הזה, לעצור את הרעה, ופשוט להתלכד ולהתאחד כדי שישראל תעבור את המכשול הזה, ואין לי ספק שהוא תעבור.
אבל אנחנו הולכים למסלול התנגשות עם הממשל האמריקאי.
ארצות הברית זה לא מקשה אחת, זה לא מקשה אחת. יש את הסנאט, יש את הקונגרס, יש את הכוח היהודי שהוא עצום, יותר חזק משהיה אי פעם. יש דעת קהל, יש לנו כוחות כבירים בדעת הקהל שמתנגדים למדיניות הזאת, גדולי הפרשנים. אמריקה לא תכפה עלינו דבר, אם לא נרצה דבר.
לא רק קודם כל לתת להם חוק, לא רק חוק כל כך מכינות, שהמחיר יקבל ביצוע, כרגע המחיר לא קבל ביצוע, גם זו התקפה רבת היקף, כמו ברשות הפלסטינית. לפחד שהכל מתמודד. ואז רגע, אבל אז השוק העולם יגיד מה אתם חושבים? אתה לא מפחד מהעולם ביבי. במיוחד היום עם אמריקה, אני יודע מה זה אמריקה, אמריקה זה לא שאפשר להזיז אותו בכדור, להזיז לכיוון הנכון.
אני חושב בעדינו, אבל כאילו...
לא יכול.
אם אנחנו עושים את משהו, אז הם...
יש עליו, תניח שלנו. 80% מהאמריקאים תומכים בה, זה אבסורד. יש לנו שם תמיכה כזאת, ואנחנו אומרים מה נעשה עם הממשל הוא היה פרו-פלסטיני בצורה קיצונית. לא פחדתי להתעמת שם, לא פחדתי להתעמת עם קלינטון, לא פחדתי להתעמת עם אובמה.